History always whispers this cruel truth to us. Everything that rises will one day fall. Every colossal structure thought invincible will one day be crushed under its own weight. However, no page of human history holds a story as magnificent, tragic, and yet as thought-provoking as the fall of the Roman Empire. Rome was not merely a state defining borders on a map. Rome was an idea, the embodiment of civilization, order, and power. They had transformed the Mediterranean, which they called Mare Nostrum, or Our Sea, into a lake in their own backyard. Their borders stretched from the misty and cold British Isles to the scorching deserts of Egypt, from the oceanic coasts of Spain to the fertile lands of Mesopotamia. For a Roman of that era, the world's boundaries were the same as the empire's. The outside world was nothing but darkness and barbarism. But how did that immortal city, considered the center of the world, that colossal structure with its marble temples and invincible legions, become a ruin crushed under the boots of savage warriors? We must acknowledge this from the outset. Rome did not fall in a single day. The barbarian swords from outside were merely the death blow. Rome, in its golden age, when it seemed at its strongest and most invincible, had already begun to decay from within. Our story begins in the final days of the glorious period considered the peak of the empire, known as the Pax Romana, or Roman Peace, at the end of the 2nd century AD. At this time, Marcus Aurelius sat on the imperial throne, not only a soldier or politician, but also a philosopher. Deeply devoted to Stoic philosophy, this wise emperor spent much of his life not in the luxury of the palace, but along the Danube River, in the freezing cold, defending the borders against Germanic tribes. Marcus Aurelius was like a weary giant shouldering the burden of that vast empire. He strived to uphold justice, law, and Roman order. But with his death in 180 AD, not only a good emperor, but also Rome's famous Golden Age was laid to rest. One of the greatest ruptures in history occurred right here. Unlike the good emperors who preceded him, Marcus Aurelius, instead of leaving the throne to a capable and adopted general, passed it on to his own son, Commodus. This decision was the first major mistake that sealed Rome's fate. Commodus was completely devoid of his father's wisdom and statesmanship. He saw the empire not as a vast mechanism to be managed, but as a vast playground created for his own amusement. He left state affairs to corrupt sycophants and spent his days fighting in the Colosseum, disguised as a gladiator under the astonished and terrified gaze of the people. He was so arrogant and insane that he declared himself the earthly reincarnation of Hercules. Commodus's megalomania shattered the illusion of first among equals, the civil leadership that Rome had built up until then, and transformed the regime into a naked tyranny. When Commodus was finally assassinated, strangled in a bathhouse, Rome thought it would breathe a sigh of relief. But the real nightmare was just beginning. The enormous structural cracks beneath the empire were now coming to light. The Roman economy relied entirely on slave labor and spoils from its conquests, but the borders had reached their limit and new conquests had ceased. With the flow of slaves cut off, agriculture and production came to a standstill. Because of the free slave labor, no technological investment had been made. Rome hadn't even considered mechanization. With production declining, it became necessary to feed and pay regular salaries to hundreds of thousands of soldiers to protect those vast borders. Then, in 193 AD, the shameful moment occurred when the streets and the state fell entirely into the hands of the military. During this period, known in history as the Year of 5 Emperors, the Praetorian Guard, the elite unit tasked with protecting the emperor, literally put the Roman Empire up for auction after assassinating the emperor. Yes, you heard that right. The soldiers climbed the palace walls and announced they would sell the imperial throne to the richest bidder. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus bought the world's greatest empire by paying the soldiers a colossal fortune each. This event was the bitterest proof of the state's complete moral and institutional bankruptcy. Rome was no longer a plaything of the laws, the Senate, or the people. It was a plaything of the legions who wielded the sword and distributed the most gold. The Golden Age was dead, the marble cracked, and the vast empire was now gripped by endless bloody civil wars, betrayals, and a vegetative state. And on the horizon, sensing this weakness, the warriors of the north were beginning to gather. The auctioning of the Roman throne by the Praetorian Guard was the destruction of the state's moral standing and the honor of its millennia-old institutions. But the real catastrophe awaiting Rome was the dark and bloody 50 years that would begin with the army's complete collapse. In 235 AD, with the assassination of the young emperor Severus Alexander in his tent by his own soldiers on the Germanic border, Rome was plunged into the most horrific, chaotic, and almost completely destructive abyss in history. This period, which historians called the 3rd century crisis, was a half-century of apocalypse in which the vast empire literally writhed in agony with all its institutions bankrupt. Consider that in that vast half-century, more than 20 emperors ascended the throne. It was an unprecedented period of carnage where almost none died of natural causes, and most were slaughtered within months by their own guards or rival legions. These men, known in history as barracks emperors, were not statesmen educated in politics and philosophy, approved by the Roman Senate. They were soldiers fighting on the borders, some illiterate, rough, ruthless, and believing only in the power of the sword. The general who promised his soldiers the most spoils and the highest pay was proclaimed emperor by his army, marched on Rome, seized the throne, and was soon assassinated by another general who promised even more money. The Roman army no longer fought the enemy for a noble cause, but fought its own citizens and other Roman legions for more spoils. These endless power struggles and civil wars gave birth to a far more deadly, silent monster that gnawed at Rome from within: hyperinflation. Emperors, needing to appease their soldiers and buy their loyalty, had to constantly distribute gold and silver. But the treasury was already depleted, and the flow of spoils had stopped years ago. As a solution, they resorted to one of the most devastating economic frauds history has ever seen: devaluing the currency. The real silver content in the famous, trustworthy Roman silver coin, the denarius, was reduced over the years from hundreds of percent to just 5%. The coins minted were no longer silver, but merely worthless pieces of bronze and copper, coated in a thin layer of silver and tarnished over time. The public and merchants immediately recognized the deception. Why should the people trust their currency when the state itself didn't? Prices skyrocketed, and the millennia-old Roman economy collapsed. People refused to use those worthless pieces of tin, and the vast empire reverted to the primitive barter system of exchange, the bartering of goods that predated the invention of money. Taxes were no longer collected in money, but in wheat, wine, and livestock. The roads lacked security. The vast Roman highways that once carried civilization were no longer filled with trade caravans, but with unpaid gangs of plunderers and rebellious soldiers. Cities began to shrink, and people sought refuge in villages and the castles of large landowners to escape taxes and plunder. These walled castles and land-bound peasants were the ancestors of feudalism, the system of manorial rule which would shape medieval Europe hundreds of years later. Rome was visibly spiraling into the dark and insular world of the Middle Ages. While the economy and politics within the country were collapsing, outside, hunters sensing the smell of blood had already begun to push the boundaries. In the east, the Sasanian Empire, a far more organized and deadly enemy, had risen. So much so that in 260 AD, the greatest humiliation in Roman history occurred. Roman Emperor Valerianus, with his massive army, set out on a campaign against the Sasanians, but suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Edessa and was taken prisoner. A mighty Roman emperor was reduced to a living stool, a slave, used as a step on the horse of the Sasanian king Shapur. He lived the rest of his life in captivity in dungeons, and when he died, his skin was flayed, stuffed with straw, and displayed in a Sasanian temple as a warning. Rome's divinely invincible legend, its belief in an empire protected by the gods, was shattered forever that day, along with Valerianus's flayed skin.
On one side, this unimaginable catastrophe in the east. On the other, barbarian Germanic tribes from the north, crossing the icy waters of the Rhine and Danube rivers, invaded Roman lands, plundering and burning. And in the midst of all this chaos, a terrible epidemic, known as the Cypriot Plague, broke out. A doomsday scenario where 5,000 people died a day, cities were filled with corpses, fields could not be cultivated, and armies were decimated by the plague. At the height of the crisis, the empire effectively disintegrated. In the west, the Gallic Empire, and in the east, the Kingdom of Palmyra declared their independence, breaking away from Rome. Rome was now fragmented, its economy ruined, its pride broken, and seemed to be breathing its last breath. Until those harsh commanders appeared who would pull the empire from the wreckage, reunited with an iron fist, but at the same time completely kill Rome's old spirit and transform it into an Eastern despotism.
After 50 years of bloody civil wars, endless assassinations, hyperinflation, and barbarian invasions that ravaged its borders, Rome was literally on its deathbed. The empire was effectively divided into three. The economy had regressed to a barter system, and state institutions were utterly bankrupt. The invincible giant of the ancient world was about to drown in its own blood. Until, in 284 AD, Diocletian, a harsh and ruthless soldier descended not from the Roman aristocracy, but from a freed slave on the Dalmatian coast, seized the throne. Diocletian was no ordinary soldier. He possessed a pragmatic intellect that saw that Rome's problems could no longer be solved by old methods, the ornate speeches of the Senate, or traditional institutions. The first truth he understood upon ascending the throne was this: old Rome was dead, and trying to revive it was futile. The famous illusion of the princeps, the first among equals, a civilian leader who had existed since Augustus, had now completely crumbled. Diocletian knew that a far harsher, far more absolute and divine power was needed to hold the state together. That is why he took Rome's civil state structure and replaced it with the ruthless, absolutist, and semi-divine despotism of the East. He declared himself not princeps, but dominus, meaning lord and master. This regime change is known in Roman history as the Dominatus period. Appearing before the emperor was no longer an ordinary matter. Visitors could no longer stand like the proud citizens of Rome of the past. They had to prostrate themselves at the emperor's feet and kiss the hem of his robe. The emperor, with his gold-embroidered robes and jeweled crown, had become a completely detached, inaccessible, divine figure. The concept of free citizenship had effectively ended. Everyone had become a subject of an absolute master. However, Diocletian's greatest blow to the state was not ideological, but administrative. He realized that the vast empire was too enormous and cumbersome to be governed by a single man from a single center. With the Germanic tribes attacking in the north and the Sassanids in the east simultaneously, a single emperor's army couldn't manage two fronts at once. The solution was one of the most radical decisions in history: to divide power. Diocletian established a brand new system he called the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. He administratively divided the empire into east and west. He became the Augustus of the east, the supreme emperor, while appointing his most trusted comrade in arms, Maximianus, as the Augustus of the west. He also appointed two Caesars, or vice-emperors, to succeed them. Rome would no longer be governed from a single center, but from four different military capitals near its borders. The artist-ironic aspect was that the famous immortal city of Rome was not among these four capitals. Rome had completely lost its political and strategic importance, becoming merely a symbolic museum. Diocletian, in order to maintain the state, froze not only the political structure, but also the social structure with an iron fist. To stop hyperinflation and feed his massive army, he enacted the first comprehensive price control law in history, the Decree on Maximum Prices. The price of every commodity, even a kilo of wheat, a pair of shoes, or a teacher's lesson, was determined by the state down to the last detail. The punishment for exceeding these prices was singular: death.
However, the laws of the economy are not written with a sword. The black market exploded, and this law ended in failure. Following this, Diocletian completely banned social mobility to ensure regular tax revenue and production for the state. Farmers were forbidden from leaving their lands. The son of a baker had to be a baker, the son of a soldier. People were chained to their professions and the lands where they were born. This rigid, state-imposed, frozen system of professions and classes formed the legal basis for the dark feudalism and serfdom, the land-bound slavery system that would engulf Europe centuries later. After 20 years of his iron-fisted rule, Diocletian did something rarely seen in history. In 305 AD, he voluntarily abdicated and retired to his palace in his hometown to cultivate cabbages. Yes, he had pulled the empire back from the brink of that bloody abyss, extending the state's life at least 2 centuries. But what he saved was no longer Rome. That classical Rome of marble statues, philosophical debates, and free citizens was dead. In its place was a vast and soulless bureaucratic machine, burdened with heavy taxes, ruled by a military dictatorship, and people chained to the ground. Moreover, the 4-part system of government Diocletian had established would collapse as soon as he retreated to that cabbage field, and the empire would rapidly descend into one of history's greatest civil wars, leading to the birth of a new monotheistic religion.
Diocletian's iron-fisted tetrarchy system was, on paper, a flawless administrative plan. However, it failed to account for human nature, especially the intoxication of power. The moment Diocletian retired to tend cabbage, the makeshift peace among his successors shattered. Rome was plunged back into the familiar and bloody spiral of civil war. But this time, the victor on the battlefield would change not only the maps, but also the minds and beliefs of the people forever. Flavius Valerius Constantine, known to history as Constantine the Great. Constantine was a young and highly ambitious general, proclaimed emperor by his legions after his father's death. His goal was not to divide Rome, but to become the absolute ruler, as in the old days. He advanced, defeating his rivals one by one, and in 312 AD, he reached the gates of Rome, the Milvian Bridge, for the great battle that would determine his fate. Facing him was his rival Maxentius, who commanded a far larger army. As Constantine waited with his army, legend says he saw a gigantic, luminous cross in the sky, cutting through the sun. Beneath it was the famous Latin prophecy, in hoc signo vinces, meaning, by this sign you will win. That night, Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint a new symbol on their shields and banners, a symbol never before seen on the Roman legions, the Chi Rho symbol, the first 2 letters of the name of Jesus Christ. When the battle began the next day, the legions, who until then had fought in the names of the Roman military gods, Mars and Jupiter, were for the first time fighting under the banner of a new monotheistic religion. Constantine won a crushing victory at the Milvian Bridge. As his rival Maxentius drowned in the muddy waters of the Tiber River under the weight of his armor, Constantine entered Rome as the absolute ruler. This victory was not merely a political success. He ignited the fuse of one of the greatest sociological revolutions in human history. A year later, with the Edict of Milan in 313, Constantine officially ended 3 centuries of bloody state terror against Christianity, the throwing of Christians to lions in stadiums, and crucifixions. Christianity was no longer an illegal, underground sect, but an official religion, recognized, respected, and even financed by the emperor himself. Rome's old pagan world of thousands of gods was dying. Constantine would use this new monotheistic religion as a brand new social glue to ideologically hold together that vast, shattered empire. The emperor was now a divine representative, deriving his power not from the sword or the Senate, but directly from the one God in the heavens.
However, Constantine's real blow to Rome was not limited to faith. Like Diocletian, he was a pragmatic man and saw a bitter truth very clearly. The city of Rome was no longer useful. The Italian peninsula had collapsed economically. The empire's true wealth lay in the east, its fertile lands, trade routes, and manpower. Furthermore, the greatest threats, the Goths on the Danube and the Sassanids on the Euphrates, were far from both fronts, and Rome was too distant to reach them. Constantine, without hesitation, decided to abandon Rome, his 1,000-year-old legendary capital, considered the capital of the world, Caput Mundi. He chose a brand new, strategically perfect location, untainted by pagan temples, Byzantium, a small Greek town on the edge of the vast strait where Europe and Asia meet and the Black Sea flows into the Mediterranean. In 330 AD, this new city, built on 7 hills, was adorned with massive walls, palaces, and churches, and declared the new capital of the empire as Nova Roma, or New Rome. However, history would remember it by the name of its founder, Constantinople, or Istanbul. This move was no ordinary change of capital. This was a shift in the axis of civilization from west to east, from marble to brick, from pagan to Christian. Old Rome had lost its political power, becoming a ghost city living in its memories, where wealthy senators spent their retirement. The heart of the empire now beat in Constantinople. Constantine had Christianized the state and extended the empire's life for centuries by moving the capital eastward, but the vulnerable lands he left behind in the west were now merely an open buffet, waiting for the colossal wave of barbarians to emerge from the dark forests of the north.
Constantine the Great's relocation of the capital eastward to that immense strait injected fresh blood and a new vision into the state. As Constantinople laid the foundations for its golden age, the impoverished Western Roman Empire, left behind, was utterly defenseless against the colossal storm that would come from the dark forests of the north. Ironically, however, the deadliest dagger to pierce the heart of Rome was not the barbarians' own plan, but the result of a domino effect created by a far more terrifying force emerging from the vast steppes of Asia, the Huns. Towards the end of the 4th century AD, the Hun horsemen, forged by the merciless winds of Central Asia, born and dying on their saddles and moving like a storm, descended upon the eastern borders of Europe like a harbinger of apocalypse. The Huns were so swift, so deadly, and so tactically superior that the native barbarian tribes of Europe, especially the Goths, were struck with terror by this invincible force. The Goths faced 2 options: either perish at the hands of the Huns or flee south, seeking refuge behind the powerful borders of the Roman Empire. In 376, an unprecedented scene unfolded. Tens of thousands of Gothic warriors, along with their women, children, and elderly, massed on the north bank of the Danube. They were hungry, weary, and terrified. They sent envoys to Emperor Valens of the Eastern Roman Empire, begging for asylum. In return, they would protect the empire's borders and provide soldiers for the Roman army. Emperor Valens saw this massive influx of migrants as a free labor force and a cheap source of soldiers for his army. His arrogance had overridden his reason. He ordered the borders opened and the Goths admitted into Roman territory. However, the Roman bureaucracy was no longer the old, disciplined state apparatus. It was a center of bribery and corruption. Instead of helping these starving people, the border commanders Lupintianus and Maximus established the most vile system of exploitation history has ever seen. They sold the supplies sent by the Roman state on the black market. To the Goths, who were driven mad by hunger, they were given only the carcasses of stray dogs as food. Things reached such a disgusting level that Roman commanders began buying Gothic children as slaves in exchange for a dog carcass.
The despair in the eyes of those proud warriors, watching their own children being chained for a piece of rotten meat, would soon give way to an untamable rage. When push came to shove, a brave Gothic leader named Fritigern raised the banner of rebellion. The mass of refugees who until then had sought refuge in Rome suddenly transformed into the world's deadliest invading army. The fertile lands, villages, and cities of Thrace were consumed by the Goths' thirst for revenge. Rome's dominance in the Balkans collapsed in seconds. Emperor Valens, wanting to suppress the rebellion and save the empire's reputation, gathered his army from the east and swiftly marched into the Balkans. His nephew Gratianus, the Western Roman emperor, had also set out with his army to aid him, but Valens' arrogance once again blinded him. To prevent his nephew from joining him in the victory, he made the suicidal decision to engage in battle alone in the scorching August heat without waiting for reinforcements. On August 9, 378, near Adrianopolis, present-day Edirne, the battle that would change the course of world history began. Rome's heavily armored legendary infantry, exhausted from thirst and heat, launched an unorganized attack. However, the Roman army encountered a tactic it had never seen before. In the midst of the battle, a massive Gothic heavy cavalry unit emerged like a storm from the horizon, encircling the Roman army from the flanks and creating a deadly ring. That afternoon, the myth of Roman military invincibility was drowned in blood on the plains of Edirne. 2/3 of the Eastern Roman field army, including its most elite generals and thousands of experienced officers, were slaughtered on that battlefield that day. But the truly shocking thing was the fate of Emperor Valens. Wounded as his army was shattered, the emperor, along with his guards, took refuge in a small 2-story wooden farmhouse on the edge of the battlefield. Unaware that an emperor was inside, the Gothic warriors, unable to break down the doors, piled up brushwood around the house and set it ablaze. The mighty Eastern Roman emperor, Valens, the shadow of God on earth, perished in the flames within that rickety wooden hut. The Adrianopolis disaster was not merely the loss of a battle. Rome was no longer fighting an enemy outside its borders. The enemy was now within, flowing through the veins of the state, and it was impossible to uproot them. The migration of peoples, which would forever change the map of Europe, had begun unstoppably.
After the disaster at Adrianople, the Roman Empire was like a heavily wounded monster whose bleeding could not be stopped. The Goths were no longer an unknown threat beyond the borders, but a rogue force directly in the heart of the empire, trampling cities in the Balkans. Emperor Theodosius I managed to temporarily freeze this crisis with diplomacy and gold. However, Theodosius's death in 395 AD was one of the thickest nails in Rome's coffin. According to his will, that vast empire was officially and permanently divided between his two incompetent sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius, who was only 10 years old, in the west. Eastern Rome, or Constantinople, thanks to its geographical location and rich treasury, managed to bribe the barbarian chieftains and direct them westward. Western Rome, on the other hand, was economically bankrupt, and on the throne sat Honorius, a cowardly child incapable of governing, preoccupied only with the pet chickens in his palace. It was in this political vacuum that the clever and furious barbarian leader who would change the course of history emerged, Alaric, king of the Visigoths. Alaric was not a savage warrior who had emerged from the jungle. On the contrary, he was a Romanized Goth who had commanded mercenaries in the Roman army for years and knew Roman military tactics, weaknesses, and how its bureaucracy worked very well. He had only one request: a safe, fertile piece of land for his people and an official general's rank in the Roman army. However, the Western Roman court, undeterred by its arrogance, repeatedly rejected Alaric's demands with humiliation. They constantly stalled him, viewing him as a dirty barbarian. The price of this arrogance would be very high. Alaric gathered his army and marched towards the defenseless Italian peninsula.
Instead of leading his army to protect his people, Emperor Honorius made one of the most shameful decisions in history. He fled the capital from Mediolanum, modern Milan, to Ravenna, a city surrounded by impassable swamps with a sea connection and seemingly impossible to besiege. The mighty Western Roman emperor, abandoning his people to the mercy of barbarians, hid behind thick walls beyond a swamp. Furthermore, he shattered Rome's last shield by unjustly executing Stilicho, the only remaining capable and brilliant general of semi-barbarian origin, due to court intrigues and paranoia. Now, nothing stood in Alaric's way. His target was no longer the cowardly emperor in Ravenna, but the heart of Rome itself. Alaric, with his army, besieged Rome, that legendary, impregnable city. He cut off all roads leading to the city and the Tiber River, halting the flow of food. A famine soon engulfed the streets of Rome, unprecedented in its scale. Meat and bread had long since run out, and even senators had begun to eat dog and rat meat. The streets were filled with the corpses of people who had died of starvation and plague. Things reached such a horrific point that chilling whispers began to spread that Roman mothers had even eaten their own children. On August 24, 410 AD, an 800-year-old legend was shattered. At midnight, the famous Porta Salaria, Rome's famous gate, was secretly opened from the inside, presumably by slaves driven mad from hunger or rebelling against their masters. The Visigoth army poured like a flood into the streets of that immortal city. The sacred capital, untouched by any foreign army for 800 years since the Gallic invasion of 390 BC, was plundered relentlessly for 3 days and 3 nights. Marble statues shattered, centuries-old gold melted down, proud senators enslaved, and massive palaces set ablaze. The sack of Rome was not merely a military event, it was the psychological apocalypse of the ancient world. As news spread across oceans, it sent shockwaves to every corner of the known world. When St. Jerome, or Hieronymus, who was living in Bethlehem at the time, received the news, he would write these famous lines in tears. "The city that conquered the whole world, now itself is conquered. My tears choke my words. The light of Rome has been extinguished." Physically, the Western Roman Empire would continue to exist on paper for a few more decades, but spiritually, it died the day those gates were broken down. Moreover, Alaric's sack was only the beginning. Very soon, the real great catastrophe, the scourge of God, which would displace even the Goths from the dark steppes of the East, would set foot on Europe.
Alaric's sack of Rome in 410 BC created an unprecedented trauma in the Western world. But history would not give Western Rome time to mourn. For the real catastrophe, the unstoppable storm of the Asian steppes that drove the Visigoths from their forests and unleashed them upon Rome, had finally reached the heart of Europe. They were the Huns, born and dying on horseback, who paralyzed Rome's cumbersome infantry with a rain of arrows in seconds. And at their head was the legendary leader whom the Christian world believed had been sent by God to punish them for their sins, Attila, also known as the Scourge of God. Attila was not merely a bloodthirsty barbarian, as Roman historians described him. He was a cunning leader whose diplomatic wit was as sharp as his sword, uniting scattered steppe tribes under a vast empire stretching from the Volga to the Rhine. Initially, he set his sights on Eastern Rome, that is, Constantinople. Although he couldn't breach the massive walls, he crushed and plundered the Balkans so ruthlessly that the Eastern Roman Empire was forced to pay him thousands of kilos of gold in tribute every year to survive. Having depleted the East's treasury and seeing the gold and spoils dwindling, Attila turned his attention in 451 to the dying colossal ruin of the Western Roman Empire. He had a perfect excuse. Honoria, the sister of the Western Roman Emperor, had secretly sent Attila a ring asking for help to escape a forced marriage. Attila announced that he accepted this ring as a marriage proposal and demanded half of the Western Roman territories as a dowry.
Of course, this was refused, and Attila, with one of the largest armies history had ever seen, invaded Gaul, the territory of present-day France. The Western Roman Empire lacked the power to stop this colossal steamroller. However, the empire had one last card to play: Flavius Aetius. This brilliant general, whom historians call the last Roman, had lived as a prisoner among the Huns in his youth, knowing their war tactics, culture, and, most importantly, Attila himself intimately. Aetius knew that Rome could not win this war alone. With incredible diplomatic maneuvering, he persuaded the Visigoths and other Germanic tribes, his old enemies with whom he had been at war for years, to unite under the Roman banner, declaring, "Our common enemy will destroy us all." In 451 AD, one of the bloodiest and most massive apocalyptic battles the ancient world had ever seen took place on the Catalan Plains, Battle of Chalons, in Gaul. On one side were Attila and the barbarian tribes who had submitted to him, and on the other, the Romans and Visigoths under the command of Aetius. The battle was so fierce that, according to legend, the waters of the river flowing through the plain that day turned completely red, and it was said that the spirits of the fallen soldiers continued to fight in the sky. After days of bloodshed, although the Visigoth king died on the battlefield, the alliance did not break up, and Attila was forced to retreat. Aetius had saved Rome from the brink. But the victory of the last Roman was only a brief respite. Attila was not defeated, only delayed. A year later, in 452, this time fueled by a thirst for revenge, he marched directly into Italy, to the heart of Rome. He crossed the Alps, wiped Aquileia off the map, and sacked Milan. The Western Roman Emperor Valentinian had once again fled the capital. Aetius had no army left to stop Attila. Rome stood completely defenseless, its gates wide open, awaiting the scourge of God. It was at this desperate moment, at this point where civil authority had completely collapsed, that a man stepped forward to change history: Pope Leo I. In an environment where even the emperor was fleeing, the Pope, with a small retinue of clergymen, left Rome and went to Attila's enormous tent on the banks of the Po River near Mantua to meet the barbarian king himself. What was discussed between the two is one of history's greatest mysteries. For centuries, the Church recounted how the spirits of St. Peter and Paul, appearing behind the Pope, terrified Attila and saved Rome through a divine miracle. The truth, however, was probably far more pragmatic. A plague had broken out in Attila's army, a great famine was sweeping through Italy, and the Eastern Roman armies were about to attack the Huns' homeland. Adding the enormous gold bribe offered by the Pope to this equation, Attila agreed to withdraw from Italy. Rome was saved from the sword that day thanks to the Pope's political genius. However, this event was the greatest proof that the era of emperors had ended in the Western world, and that the Church, the papacy, had risen as the sole true power. A year later, on his own wedding night, Attila was found dead in his bed, covered in blood, probably from an internal hemorrhage. The vast steppe empire he had built was torn apart among his sons and erased from the pages of history. But the blow he dealt to Western Rome was so heavy that all that remained was a hollowed-out, withered skeleton. And very soon, a new enemy from across the sea would set sail to reduce that skeleton to dust.
Attila's unexpected death and the disintegration of the Hunnic Empire brought a sigh of relief to the Western Roman court. However, this relief was not a sign of recovery, but rather a harbinger of impending coma. For only one pillar remained to hold the state together: Flavius Aetius, the commander-in-chief who had stopped Attila on the Catalonian plains, revered by the soldiers and hailed as a hero by the people. But history shows us that weak, cowardly, and incompetent rulers fear their own heroes more than the enemies of the state. The Western Roman Emperor Valentinianus was precisely such a man. For years he had hidden in the safe swamps of Ravenna, shifting the burden of the empire onto Aetius's shoulders.
However, Aetius's growing power and prestige fueled the morbid paranoia within Valentinianus. Incited by sycophants in the court, the emperor became so blind that he preferred to leave the state defenseless rather than share power. In 454 AD, one of the most foolish murders in history was committed in the Ravenna court. Emperor Valentinian, summoning Aetius to his presence for budget discussions, began to argue with him. Unable to control his anger, the emperor drew his sword and, in full view of the palace guards, murdered the brilliant general who had saved the state from ruin, the last Roman. Following the murder, the famous words of a court sage to the emperor perfectly summarized the impending disaster. "Your Majesty, I do not know exactly what you have done today, but all I know is that you have cut off your own left hand with your right." Rome was now completely without its shield. Moreover, this betrayal did not go unpunished. Just a few months later, Aetius's loyal soldiers avenged their actions by assassinating Emperor Valentinian during a military parade. With Valentinian's death, the Theodosian dynasty, which had ruled Western Rome for almost a century, came to a bloody end. A wealthy senator named Petronius Maximus, who seized the throne by force, compelled the deceased emperor's widow, Licinia Eudoxia, to marry him in order to gain legitimacy. But Eudoxia was disgusted by this man who collaborated with her husband's murderers. In desperation, just as her sister-in-law Honoria had done to Attila years earlier, she sought help from outside the empire, from across the sea, from Gaiseric, the ruthless and cunning king of the Vandals, the new ruler of North Africa. The Vandals were no ordinary barbarian tribe. They had crossed the Rhine River, entered Spain, then passed Gibraltar and seized North Africa, Rome's breadbasket, the lands of present-day Tunisia and Algeria. Carthage, the greatest granary of the ancient world, was now in their hands, and they were strangling Rome. Even more frightening, the Vandals had learned seafaring and built a massive pirate fleet that plundered the Mediterranean. Eudoxia's plea for help was a golden key for Gaiseric, opening the gates of Rome. In the spring of 455 AD, the Vandal fleet appeared at Ostia, the port of Rome. There was neither an Aetius nor an army to defend the city. The false emperor Petronius Maximus, attempting to flee, was stoned to death in the streets by an enraged Roman populace, his body thrown into the Tiber River. When the Vandals reached the gates of Rome, the familiar solitary figure, Pope Leo I, emerged from the city to meet them. Pope Leo pleaded with Gaiseric not to burn the city or massacre its inhabitants. Gaiseric accepted the offer. He would not shed blood. He would not reduce the city to ashes, but in return he implemented an unprecedented systematic plan of plunder. Alaric's sack 45 years ago was a 3-day chaotic plunder by enraged barbarians. The Vandal sack lasted 14 days. This was a cold-blooded, calculated, and bureaucratic robbery. Houses, temples, and palaces were searched room by room, inch by inch. Even the gold plating on the roof of the Temple of Jupiter was stripped and loaded onto ships. Sacred relics, priceless statues, and thousands of Roman aristocrats, brought as spoils from Jerusalem hundreds of years earlier, were taken to North Africa to be sold as slaves. Eudoxia and her daughters were among the captives. When the Vandals left the city, what remained was not a burnt ruin, but a vast, silent skeleton, completely emptied and drained of its soul. The word vandalism, which today signifies senseless and savage destruction, is the horrific legacy of that 14-day cold-blooded exploitation. The empire was now an illusion, and the time had come to hammer the final nail in the coffin.
Following the Vandals' cold-blooded, bureaucratic, and systematic looting that lasted 14 days, the Western Roman Empire was no longer a state, but merely a ruin. Its borders had long since evaporated, Britain abandoned, and Spain and Gaul in the hands of barbarian kingdoms.
All that remained of the empire was the Italian peninsula and a small stretch of the southern French coast. But the real tragedy wasn't the shrinking of its borders, but the destruction of Rome's legendary political glory. In those last 20 years after 455, the Western Roman throne was no longer a sacred peak fought for, but a poisoned seat, a death sentence where whoever sat on it was ultimately assassinated. Real power no longer resided in the hands of emperors, the Senate, or the laws. Power rested on the swords of shadow generals of barbarian origin who held the title of Magister Militum, meaning commander-in-chief of the army, controlling the entire military. The most famous, cunning, and longest-lived of these generals was Ricimer of Germanic descent. Ricimer, not being a pure-blooded Roman, could never become emperor according to Roman law and popular prejudice. He turned this situation to his advantage. "Since I cannot be emperor, I will create them," he said. Ricimer, known in history as the Kingmaker, ruled the state alone from the shadows of the Ravenna palace for years. He placed the aristocrat he desired on the throne and mercilessly executed or poisoned those who dared to make independent decisions or failed to do so. The great Western Roman emperors were nothing more than pathetic puppets in Ricimer's hands, merely stamping seals and wearing purple cloaks. Indeed, when Majorian, an emperor appointed by Ricimer, acted Roman enough to try to rebuild the state and the navy, Ricimer had him arrested and beheaded with his own hands. Even after Ricimer's death in 472, this shadow play continued. The state treasury was completely empty. The army defending Italy consisted entirely of mercenaries from the Herul, Skier, and other Germanic tribes, and there wasn't a single gold coin left to pay them. It was in this utter despair, in 475, that an interesting figure emerged, Orestes. He was a shrewd diplomat who years earlier had served as a secretary in the court of Attila, the scourge of God, and now had risen to become the commander-in-chief of the Roman army. Orestes staged a coup in Ravenna, exiling the legitimate emperor Julius Nepos. However, instead of ascending the throne himself, he made one of history's most tragic-comic decisions, declaring his own son, only 14 years old, emperor. The child's full name was Flavius Romulus Augustus. Consider the irony of history, this unbelievable twist of fate. The first king to found the city of Rome was named Romulus. The first emperor to found the Roman Empire was named Augustus. And now on this helpless child, the last leaf of that enormous millennial tree, that immortal Rome, the names of both founders were united. But no one took this child seriously. The people and historians mockingly nicknamed him Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus. Romulus Augustulus was a fearful youth, a plaything in his father's hands, capable of ruling only his own bedroom, not the empire. The final blow was not long in coming. The Germanic mercenaries in Italy, not receiving their wages, demanded a share of Italian territory from Orestes. When Orestes refused to give the heart of Rome to the barbarians, a revolt erupted. At the head of the army was a massive, ruthless, and utterly determined barbarian officer named Odoacer. In August 476, Odoacer stormed Ravenna with his army and put Orestes to the sword. When Odoacer entered the deep corridors of the palace, the emperor's throne room with his bloody sword, he found 14-year-old Romulus Augustulus trembling before him. This barbarian general who had slaughtered thousands on the battlefield did something unexpected. He took pity on the boy. Instead of killing him, he had his imperial armor and purple cloak removed, granted him a lifelong pension, and exiled him to a villa on the Bay of Naples. But the Odoacer real move was a great symbolic act that no barbarian before him had dared to attempt. He did not appoint another puppet emperor, nor wear the imperial crown himself. Instead, he packed the sacred scepter, purple cloak, crown, and all the imperial insignia of the Western Roman Empire into wooden chests and sent them to Constantinople, to the Eastern Roman Emperor Zenon, with a letter. The letter contained these cold, bureaucratic, and deadly words. The West no longer needs an emperor. One emperor, the emperor in Constantinople, suffices for the world. Please accept these insignia and recognize me as the ruler of Italy. Thus, in 476 AD, the vast Western Roman Empire, whose borders once stretched from Scotland to the Sahara Desert, vanished from the face of history, not through a bloody battle, great explosions, or epic resistance, but simply through a silent, bureaucratic letter, a packing process. Rome had silently perished, but its legend would continue to rule the world for millennia to come.
On that foggy summer day in 476 AD, when the barbarian general Odoacer packed the sacred imperial symbols of Western Rome into a wooden chest and sent them eastward, the most glorious chapter of the ancient world quietly closed. That invincible giant, whose borders once stretched from the misty mountains of Scotland to the scorching sands of the Sahara Desert, and who had made the Mediterranean his own lake, vanished from the stage of history, crushed by its own arrogance, corruption, and bureaucratic decay. With the fall of Western Rome, Europe experienced an unprecedented loss of civilization. The long, cold, and insular period that historians call the Dark Ages began. The colossal aqueducts dried up, the roads were overgrown with weeds, marble statues were melted down in limestone kilns, and literacy rates plummeted to near zero. People became so alienated from their past that they looked upon the enormous colosseums, pantheons, and temples built by their ancestors and believed they had been constructed not by humans, but by giants who had lived in ancient times. The state was replaced by warlords, and citizenship by serfdom tied to the land, in other words, feudalism. But there's another side to the coin. It wasn't just the western half of Rome that collapsed. Behind the massive, impenetrable walls of Constantinople, or present-day Istanbul, the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as Byzantium, would continue to exist for another 1,000 years. Protecting Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology behind those thick walls, they preserved the seeds of the Renaissance, which would illuminate Europe centuries later. So, did Rome truly die in the West? The answer is a resounding no. Even though Rome physically collapsed, it transformed spiritually and institutionally, permeating the very fabric of the world. Countries like Spain, France, and Italy, which you see on a map of Europe today, are actually Romanized descendants of those old barbarian kingdoms. The languages they speak, French, Spanish, and Italian, are surviving versions of the crude Latin spoken in those muddy streets. Rome's sword was broken, but its law continued to govern the world. The foundation of the civil law, property rights, contracts, and court systems we use in the modern world today is directly rooted in Roman law. Even our political architecture is their creation. Fundamental concepts of political science, such as republic, senate, veto, and dictator, are indelible marks left on human history by that city of 7 hills. And most importantly, faith. The title Pontifex Maximus, Great Priest, worn by Caesar and Augustus, is still used by the Pope in the Vatican today. The bureaucratic structure, episcopal regions, and hierarchy of the Roman Empire were copied and carried forward as the backbone of the Catholic Church. The Roman Empire never truly died. It was merely baptized and transformed into the Church, continuing to spiritually govern the world. This vast story, which we have recounted over 10 chapters, teaches us one of history's sharpest lessons. No state, no matter how large its armies or how high its walls, can be destroyed from the outside without first decaying from within. Any system where justice disappears, merit is replaced by sycophancy.
Income inequality widens to chasms, and rulers become detached from the reality of their own people, sooner or later creates its own barbarians and is doomed to collapse. Thank you for accompanying us on this bloody, glorious, and cautionary tale of Rome's fall. If you enjoyed this vast historical journey, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments which details surprised you the most. Until we meet again in a new story on the dusty pages of history, farewell.